Why the sheriff paid $3 to shame a 19-year-old virgin bride. And what the rancher did next. Morning light slipped through the high windows of the courthouse and fell in pale bands across the wooden floor, catching dust in the air as the room filled with people who had come for business and stayed for spectacle. Because a 19-year-old bride stood near the front with her hands clenched and her eyes wet, and everyone sensed something was about to be made of her. She wore a plain dress meant for beginnings, not judgment. And the way she held herself, chin lowered, shoulders tight, invited the kind of authority that mistook quiet for permission. The sheriff stood a few paces away, boots planted, voice casual as he explained that a fine had been assessed for impropriety, a word vague enough to bruise without proving anything at all. And when he reached into his pocket and placed 3 coins on the clerk's desk, the sound rang louder than it should have. $3 was not payment. It was a message, small enough to insult and public enough to humiliate, and the bride flinched as if the coins had been tossed at her feet. Murmurs rippled through the benches, some uneasy, others curious, because people understood money when it was used to measure worth, and this measure felt deliberate. The sheriff smiled thinly and said the matter could end there if she accepted the fine, and the clerk hesitated, pen hovering, aware that writing it down would turn the insult into record. The bride did not speak. Her silence stretched, and the room leaned in, mistaking stillness for surrender, until the sheriff repeated himself with a shrug that suggested mercy had already been offered. A cough broke the hush, then another, and eyes shifted as a rancher stepped into the aisle from the back, hat in hand, dust on his cuffs, having arrived late and understood enough at a glance to know something was wrong. He did not ask what she had done. He looked at where the coins lay, at the way the bride's face had drained of color, and at the clerk's pen poised to make humiliation official. The sheriff noticed him then and lifted a brow, as if daring interruption, and a few people smiled in anticipation of raised voices, because conflict felt easier than reflection. The rancher stopped beside the bride, not touching her, only standing close enough that the space changed, and he asked the clerk to wait, his tone level and unhurried, as though asking for time rather than permission. The sheriff scoffed and said the fine was lawful, that order required consequences, and the rancher answered that consequences did not require spectacle, and that if there was a charge, it could be named plainly or dropped altogether. The bride's breath hitched, the first sound she had made, and the room went still again as the rancher reached into his coat. Not for money, but for a folded paper he set on the desk beside the coins. He said, calmly enough to be mistaken for politeness, that whatever claim was being made ended now, because she was under his roof, and responsibility, spoken aloud in daylight, shifted the weight of the room before anyone could decide whether they approved. The coins lay on the clerk's desk like a challenge, small and bright, carrying more weight than their value because everyone in the room understood that $3 was not meant to settle a matter, but to shrink a person. The sheriff folded his arms and said the fine was lawful, that standards had to be enforced, and that leniency had already been shown. But the words felt thin now that the rancher stood beside the bride, close enough to interrupt the story the room had agreed to tell. The bride kept her eyes lowered, breath shallow, aware that every movement was being measured, and the way her shoulders drew inward made it clear that the humiliation was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The rancher did not raise his voice or accuse the sheriff directly. Instead, he asked the clerk what charge had been entered, and the question landed awkwardly because no one had heard one named. The clerk hesitated, glancing at the ledger, and the pause stretched long enough for people in the benches to shift, realizing that they had been watching something proceed without a foundation. The sheriff brushed it off, saying some matters did not require formality, that reputation alone justified correction, and the explanation unsettled the room because it suggested that shame could replace proof when it was convenient. The rancher answered calmly that correction without charge was not law, it was theater, and that theaters needed audiences willing to clap. A few heads turned away at that because the line had found its mark. The bride's hands trembled as she clasped them tighter, fighting the urge to cry, and the sound of her breath caught the attention of a woman seated near the aisle, who pressed her lips together as if remembering something she had chosen not to say earlier. The sheriff insisted again that the fine could be paid and the matter closed, and he nudged the coin slightly forward, an invitation that felt more like a dare. The rancher stepped closer to the desk then and placed his palm flat beside the money, not covering it, only anchoring the space, and said the bride would not accept a humiliation disguised as mercy. He explained, plainly and without flourish, that she was under his roof now, meaning responsibility had shifted, and whatever claim existed would have to be named properly or abandoned. The room went still, because under my roof was not a threat or a purchase. It was an obligation spoken aloud, and obligations carried consequences. The clerk cleared his throat and said he could not record a fine without a charge, and the admission cracked the moment open because procedure had finally been allowed to catch up. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he realized the crowd was no longer with him, and the bride felt something ease in her chest. Not relief yet, but the knowledge that the $3 could no longer define her. A heavy quiet settled over the courtroom, the kind that arrived when people realized they had been participating without speaking. And the bride felt it press against her chest as the sheriff's confidence began to thin in the open air. He tried to regain control by reminding everyone that authority required efficiency, that courts were not places for hesitation, but the words no longer carried the weight they had minutes earlier, because efficiency had just been exposed as convenience. The rancher remained beside the bride, not touching her, not guiding her, simply occupying space that forced the room to acknowledge her presence as more than a problem to be resolved. The clerk stared at the ledger again, aware that writing anything now would mean choosing a side. And the pause spread unease through the benches, because no one wanted to be the first to admit they had allowed humiliation to pass for order. A man cleared his throat near the back and muttered that everyone knew the accusation was weak, and the admission landed softly but carried far, because it confirmed what many had felt and ignored. The sheriff turned sharply and demanded order, warning that gossip did not replace law. Yet the warning rang hollow now that the lack of a formal charge had been exposed. The bride lifted her head a fraction, enough to breathe more fully, and the small movement reminded the room that she was still standing there, still being decided upon without having spoken a word. The rancher asked one question, quiet but precise, about whether the court intended to proceed with evidence or continue with implication. And the question cut deeper than argument, because it offered only two paths forward. The clerk spoke again, firmer this time, saying he could not record a penalty without a charge, and the sentence broke something loose in the room, because it marked the moment when procedure stopped protecting authority and started protecting a person. The sheriff accused the rancher of turning sentiment into leverage, of using reputation to interfere. And the rancher answered that reputation meant nothing if it was not spent to stop injustice when it appeared. A woman in the benches nodded once without realizing it, and the nod was noticed because agreement no longer felt dangerous. The sheriff hesitated, measuring the room, and that hesitation was visible enough to matter, because power faltered when it had to look around for support. When he finally said the matter would be reviewed, the words sounded controlled, but the effect was unmistakable. The humiliation had been interrupted, and interruption had teeth. The bride felt a tightness ease in her chest, not relief yet, but space, and the crowd felt something shift with it, understanding too late that silence had protected the wrong person until someone finally refused to maintain it. The decision to review the matter did not end the tension in the courtroom. It sharpened it, because delay stripped away the comfort of finality and left everyone alone with what they had almost accepted. The sheriff stepped back from the desk, jaw tight, realizing that the $3 now sat exposed, not as a solution, but as evidence of intent. And the clerk pushed the coins aside slightly, an unconscious gesture that signaled the room had already moved on. The bride stood very still, aware that survival sometimes arrived quietly and demanded patience rather than celebration. And she kept her hands folded to steady their shaking, knowing eyes were still on her, even if their purpose had changed. The rancher remained close, but unobtrusive, his presence firm enough to hold the boundary without turning it into spectacle. And the restraint mattered because it left no excuse for escalation. A murmur passed through the benches as people leaned toward one another, not to gossip but to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they believed about fairness. And the sound carried a different tone now, less curious and more careful. The sheriff attempted to recover authority by reminding the court that reviews took time, that accusations did not vanish simply because someone objected. And the rancher answered that time was exactly what had been denied moments earlier, when humiliation had been offered as efficiency. The exchange drew attention to the imbalance without inflaming it, and several heads nodded before anyone realized they were agreeing. The clerk cleared his throat and said the review would require statements to be taken properly, witnesses sworn and evidence named, and the formality of the list reassured the room because it returned justice to familiar ground. The bride felt her knees weaken at the thought of speaking later, but she also felt a steadiness she had not known earlier, because the process now acknowledged her as someone who would be heard rather than managed. A woman near the aisle rose briefly and sat again, hands clasped. And the movement echoed around the room as others adjusted, recognizing themselves as participants rather than spectators. The sheriff watched the shift and understood that control had not been taken from him. It had been narrowed, and the narrowing exposed where it had overreached. He gathered his papers and announced the court would recess until statements could be prepared. And though the words were procedural, the effect was personal, because the bride was no longer alone beneath attention. As people began to stand, the rancher turned slightly toward her and said they would step outside, his tone offering direction without command. And she nodded, grateful for motion that did not feel like escape. When they walked toward the door together, no one blocked the way and no one followed. And the courtroom felt the quiet weight of what daylight had done to the price that was meant to shame her. Because $3, once challenged, could no longer buy agreement. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than it had inside, because daylight made everything more visible, including the faces of people who had followed them out, pretending they were only stretching their legs. The bride stood near the steps, hands clasped tightly, unsure whether leaving the building meant safety or only a different kind of exposure. And she kept her eyes on the ground as murmurs gathered around her like dust. The sheriff lingered near the doorway, hat pulled low, listening as fragments of conversation reached him. Questions about whether the fine had ever been lawful, doubts about why the matter had been handled so quickly, quiet admissions that the $3 had felt wrong the moment it was placed on the desk. The rancher waited until the noise settled into something less sharp, then turned slightly toward the small cluster that had formed, not addressing them as a crowd, but as individuals who could still choose how the moment would end. He said nothing about the sheriff and nothing about the law at first. Instead, he stated plainly that public shame lingered longer than any ruling, and that once inflicted, it could not be taken back with paperwork alone. The simplicity of the statement unsettled people more than accusation would have, because it asked them to look at what they had watched without offering an excuse. Someone muttered that the bride should be grateful it had not gone further, and the rancher answered calmly that gratitude did not belong in a place where harm had already been done. The bride felt her throat tighten at that, because it was the first time someone had spoken, as if what she felt mattered more than how quickly the town could move on. The sheriff stepped forward then, attempting to reassert order by reminding everyone that the review would determine the outcome. And the rancher agreed, saying outcomes mattered, but so did what happened in between. He placed himself slightly in front of the bride again, not blocking her view, only making it clear she would not be addressed directly by speculation or pity. And the boundary held because it had been drawn early enough to matter. A woman from the benches approached and pressed a folded handkerchief into the bride's hand without a word, then stepped back before thanks could be demanded. And the gesture carried more weight than apology because it did not ask to be acknowledged. The sheriff watched the exchange and understood that authority had shifted in a way he could not reverse with command, because the room had learned restraint. As the crowd thinned, the rancher told the bride they would leave town for the day. That distance would give the review time to become something real. And she nodded, relief and fear moving together in her chest. When they turned toward the road, no one followed and no one called after them, and the silence felt earned, because it marked the first moment since morning when the bride was no longer being measured against a price someone else had set. The road out of town curved gently past the last buildings, and with each step, the bride felt the courthouse loosen its grip on her breath, though the memory of the coins still clung like a bruise she could not yet touch. The rancher walked beside her at an even pace, not filling the quiet with reassurance, because reassurance often tried to hurry what needed time, and he understood that safety felt different once it had been threatened in daylight. When she finally asked what he meant by his words in the courtroom, why he had said she was under his roof, he did not answer immediately, choosing his steps carefully as if the ground itself required respect. He told her that roofs were promises before they were shelter, that claiming responsibility meant being seen when things went wrong and staying when it would be easier to disappear, and that the phrase had weight because it bound him to her well-being without demanding anything in return. The explanation settled slowly, not as comfort, but as clarity. And the bride felt a steadiness replace the panic that had followed her since morning. They passed a pair of riders headed toward town, who glanced at them and then looked away, curiosity dulled by the knowledge that the moment had already moved on, and the lack of attention felt like a gift. The rancher said the review would take time, that the sheriff would be forced to justify actions that had relied on silence, and the truth often traveled slower than humiliation, but lasted longer once it arrived. She listened, hands clasped, aware that being protected did not erase what had happened, but it did change what could happen next. As the land opened into fields and fence lines, she noticed how the sky seemed wider, how choices returned in small pieces, the choice to speak, to rest, to decide where to stand when the town called again. The rancher pointed out the turnoff to his place and said she could stay as long as the review required, not as a guest who owed politeness, but as someone whose safety had been publicly claimed and therefore publicly defended. The distinction mattered, because it made shelter a continuation of the boundary he had drawn in the courtroom, not a retreat from it. When they reached the gate, he stepped aside and let her enter first, repeating nothing, trusting the action to hold its meaning. She crossed with measured steps, aware that dignity returned in increments, not declarations, and that responsibility, once spoken aloud, reshaped the future more reliably than anger ever could. By the time the sun slipped lower and shadows stretched across the main street, the town had already begun to feel the weight of what had been said in the courthouse. Because "under my roof" was not something people forgot easily once it had been spoken in public. The sheriff heard it first in fragments, not accusations but hesitations. The way conversations slowed when his name came up, the way questions were asked instead of assumptions. And he understood that authority, once exposed, did not collapse loudly, but thinned quietly. Merchants who had watched the scene replayed it to one another in careful language, focusing less on the bride and more on the coins, on how $3 had nearly passed as justice, until someone refused to accept the exchange. A woman who had been seated near the aisle admitted she had wanted to speak, but had been afraid of standing alone, and the admission unsettled her listeners because it mirrored their own silence too closely. Children overheard enough to sense that something important had happened, repeating the phrase "under my roof" as if testing its shape. And parents corrected them gently, realizing too late how clearly power could be named when it was stripped of threat. The sheriff tried to move through his duties as usual, but the ease was gone. Each decision now felt heavier, measured against the moment he had allowed humiliation to masquerade as order. And he found himself delaying actions he once would have rushed, because speed no longer felt neutral. At the ranch, the bride sat on the porch as evening cooled the land, listening to the distant sounds of cattle and wind, aware that her absence had left a mark more visible than her presence ever had. And she wondered whether returning would reopen wounds or finally close them. The rancher said little, understanding that protection extended beyond proximity, and that her choice to stay or leave would shape the next chapter more than any argument could. As night settled, word reached them that the review would proceed formally, witnesses called, statements taken properly, and the news carried relief without celebration, because it confirmed that the claim made in daylight had held through dusk. The bride felt a cautious steadiness take root, not hope yet, but the knowledge that she had not been discarded back into silence once the moment passed. In town, people lay awake longer than usual, replaying the scene not with outrage but with discomfort, because they recognized how close they had come to agreeing with something they would have condemned if it had not been familiar. By morning, the story had already shifted, no longer about a girl or a fine, but about a line that had been drawn and held, and the town felt it. Understanding that responsibility, once claimed out loud, changed more than a verdict ever could. Morning came clear and unkind, the sort of light that refused to soften edges. And the bride felt its honesty settle into her bones as she and the rancher rode back toward town, not to seek comfort, but to finish what interruption had begun. The courthouse stood the same as before, boards sun-worn and windows high. Yet the space around it felt altered, as if the ground remembered the sound of coins striking wood, and would not forget it easily. People noticed them early, heads turning with less curiosity and more caution, because daylight demanded explanations that night could postpone. The bride dismounted at the edge of the square and took a breath before stepping forward, choosing her pace, choosing her posture, aware that returning was not an apology but a claim. The rancher stayed a few steps back, visible but silent, letting the moment belong to her without withdrawing the responsibility he had taken. Inside the courthouse, the clerk looked up first, surprise giving way to recognition, and cleared space at the desk as if anticipating what was required now. The sheriff entered from a side door and paused when he saw her standing there, not bowed and not waiting to be told where to stand. And the pause traveled through the room because it signaled that certainty had been replaced by attention. Statements were called, names spoken, And for the first time, the accusation had to carry itself without spectacle, and it faltered under the weight. A witness contradicted himself. A timeline refused to align. The missing justification, once glossed over by haste, became impossible to ignore when spoken slowly. The bride listened without interruption, hands steady, knowing that presence itself was a kind of testimony. And when she was finally asked to speak, she did so plainly, describing what had happened without ornament or defense, refusing both pity and anger. The rancher remained silent, eyes forward, trusting the process he had insisted upon to do the work it had been denied earlier. Murmurs rose and fell, not in judgment, but in recognition. And the clerk's pen moved carefully now, recording substance instead of insult. When the sheriff conceded that the fine could not stand and the accusation lacked merit, the words sounded procedural, but the effect was personal, because correction arrived without erasing what had been revealed. The bride felt no triumph, only a steadiness that came from having been seen correctly at last. As she stepped back from the desk, people made room without being asked, and the space felt different from before, earned rather than granted. She walked out into the square again, daylight full on her face, and the town understood that what had changed was not the outcome alone, but the path to it. And paths, once altered, rarely return to their old shape. The courthouse emptied in stages, people leaving not with the quick relief that followed spectacle, but with the slower weight of recognition, because nothing about what had happened could be returned to its place as if it were only a misunderstanding. The bride stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in the open air, aware that correction did not erase exposure, and the dignity restored still carried the outline of where it had been taken. The sheriff lingered near the doorway, hat in hand now, speaking to no one in particular. And the silence around him felt earned rather than imposed, because authority, once examined, did not recover through posture alone. A few townsfolk approached the bride with tentative words that stopped short of apology, offering assistance instead, directions, work, a place to sit. And the shift mattered, because it traded explanation for action. She accepted what was offered selectively, not out of pride but out of care, knowing that taking everything would turn responsibility into charity. And she had already been priced once that morning. The rancher waited nearby without hovering, understanding that support meant staying available without directing the moment, and the space he gave allowed her to choose how visible she wished to be. In small clusters, people discussed the $3, not as money, but as symbol, recognizing how easily insult had been mistaken for order. And the realization unsettled them because it named a habit rather than an exception. The clerk locked the ledger with deliberate care, as if sealing more than a record, and the sound of it closing echoed softly in the hall, reminding those who heard it that process, once slowed, carried a different gravity. Children watched from the edge of the square, absorbing tone rather than detail, sensing that something important had been corrected without shouting, and parents noticed how carefully they were listening. The bride met the rancher's eyes once and nodded, a gesture that carried neither debt nor gratitude alone, but acknowledgement of a boundary held when it mattered. As they walked away from the courthouse together, the town resumed its movement in pieces, wagons creaking, doors opening, voices returning. But the rhythm had changed. Less eager to rush, more willing to pause. People understood that what had been exposed could not be paid back with kindness or erased with distance, because the cost had not been financial. It had been communal. The $3 would never be returned to her in any meaningful way, and everyone knew it, because humiliation spent publicly demanded a different kind of accounting. What remained was the choice each person carried forward, whether to allow convenience to speak louder than care the next time a price was placed on someone's dignity. And the weight of that choice followed them as the day went on, refusing to be set down as easily as the coins that had started it all. When the bride finally left town for good, there was no crowd to mark it and no words spoken to frame it into something easier to remember. Only the steady sound of hooves on the road and the quiet understanding that some moments did not end cleanly just because a decision had been corrected. She rode beside the rancher for a short distance before the road divided, and at the crossing he stopped, not to give instruction or reassurance, but to acknowledge that responsibility, once claimed, did not require permanence to remain real. He told her the roof he had named was not a chain, but a line that had been drawn when it mattered, and that she would not be spoken for again unless she chose it. And the clarity of that left her steadier than comfort ever had. She nodded once, the gesture small but complete, and turned her horse toward her own direction without looking back, because leaving upright mattered more than leaving remembered. Back in town, the courthouse returned to its routine. Yet something in the air resisted speed now, as if the walls themselves remembered how easily a person had been reduced to coins. The sheriff resumed his duties with care that bordered on hesitation, aware that decisiveness would no longer be mistaken for fairness. And the clerk took longer with his ledger, recording not just outcomes, but how they were reached. People spoke of the incident less often than expected, and when they did, it was not with outrage or pride, but with restraint, focusing on the pause rather than the confrontation, the moment when silence had finally been interrupted. Children repeated the phrase, "under my roof," without understanding its full weight. And parents corrected them gently, realizing how quickly language could teach responsibility when spoken plainly. The rancher returned to his work without recognition or thanks, understanding that intervention done for reward rarely lasted beyond applause, and the absence of celebration protected the boundary he had drawn from becoming performance. Weeks later, when another accusation surfaced in the square, it did not gather as quickly, and someone asked for proof before tone hardened. Another waited before agreeing, and the chain broke before it could tighten. No one mentioned the bride by name, and they did not need to, because the lesson had detached itself from her and settled into the town instead. What stayed after the door closed was not justice perfected or harm undone, but awareness sharpened, the kind that made people slower to price dignity and quicker to question convenience. The $3 were long gone, spent or forgotten. Yet their echo remained, reminding everyone who had heard them strike the desk that some costs could not be refunded, only carried forward, and that the real measure of change was not what was corrected once, but what was refused the next time it tried to pass unnoticed. If this story made you think, like the video, share it with someone who believes justice should never be for sale, and subscribe for more Western American tales.